I do want to go back to the lead story of our show. Earlier in the show, we did discuss the Alabama and South Florida game. Alabama does win 17-3, but it wasn't pretty. Alabama ends up holding on. They finished with 107 yards passing offense in this game. Now, admittedly, listen, the weather got really bad. There was a weather delay, all of that. But why I bring it up is because Jalen Milroe, who started last week against Texas, he was benched. Tyler Buckner starts in his place. He goes 5 of 14 passing, and he is benched for Ty Simpson, who as of last week was the third stringer and actually looked a little bit decent, but really, ultimately struggled pretty much like everybody else has. Alabama does hold on to win, Jason, but quarterback seems to be an issue. Offensive line seems to be an issue. Alabama was able to run the ball a little bit late, but that felt more like a byproduct of just wearing down the South Florida defense than any type of domination up front. Doesn't look good, Jason, for Alabama, which is 2-1, but really struggled against South Florida, which admittedly is probably the worst team left on their schedule. And there don't appear to be a lot of obvious answers on this roster.
No, and the quarterback that's going to take them to the promised land doesn't exist right now. Milroe, maybe he's somebody that grows into something, and the guy that comes in late in the game is somebody that can play. Ty is somebody that was highly recruited, but he's not ready yet. Maybe he becomes ready, but that's not a fix that happens this year. You look at the rest of the schedule right now for Alabama, at least what's relevant on it. They play Ole Miss next week. They get them at home, but I don't know if that matters. Ole Miss didn't look great against Georgia Tech, but they pulled away late tonight. They play Tennessee. They play LSU. They play Auburn. They also get A&M in there. The SEC, the one benefit if you're an Alabama fan right now, because I don't think the college football playoff is something that needs to be talked about regarding Alabama this year. I don't see it. I don't think that it is a discussion that needs to be had. They're not good enough to be in the college football playoff. They're just not. They're not deep enough. The secondary is a struggle. The offensive line is a struggle. Not having a definitive QB1 that really should be a QB1 at a university like Alabama, that's a concern. But the one saving grace that you do have is that it does appear like the SEC is kind of weak this year. So you're going to potentially end up in spots where you're competitive enough to maybe win a few of these games, pick off games that if some of these schools were really firing on all cylinders, you wouldn't. But this Alabama team, the fix doesn't exist, as we've talked about throughout this program. This is going to be one of those years. I predict right now, I think 9-3 is the ceiling for this team. I just do. I mean, they've already lost one. You look at the rest of this schedule, if you're going to struggle like that against South Florida, and you know that the quarterback's not there, then you have to rely on everybody else that you play falling apart more than you've fallen apart in order to end up with a 10-win season. I just don't see it.
The only saving grace, as you just said, the SEC right now is really struggling. LSU obviously took the loss to Florida State. Ole Miss today did win, but they had trouble putting away Georgia Tech. A&M, we talked about them last week. Tennessee loses to Florida, a game that we didn't even really talk about tonight, Jason. So that's the only saving grace. By the way, at Kentucky, at Auburn, the final two regular season games in the SEC. Earlier in the show, we had Ryan Fowler on, Tide 100.9. He hosts Monday through Friday down there in Tuscaloosa. And we asked him about the possibility of retirement. I'm going to play it in a minute, but I'll tell you what. Let's go ahead and play. Ryan Fowler was on earlier. Again, Tide 100.9. He hosts Monday through Friday in Tuscaloosa. And we asked him, if things go bad, is this the end for Nick Saban?
No, I don't see Nick Saban retiring, but I do see a big adjustments that needed. And I do ask the question, does he have enough energy to make these difficult decisions to be able to get it headed in the right direction?
That was Ryan Fowler, again, Tide 100.9, joining us earlier in the show. If you missed any of it, make sure to go back and download the podcast after. But I'll cut to the chase, Jason. You said the ceiling for this team right now appears to be 9-3. Let's say they don't quite hit the ceiling. Let's say they go 8-4 this year, which would be by far the worst regular season that Alabama has had under Nick Saban since his first season, which was all the way back in 2007. You heard what Ryan Fowler said. Nick Saban isn't a quitter. He's not going to give up. But he also said he's 72 years old. He'll be 72 years old later this fall. Does he have the energy? Because, again, the Steve Sarkisians, the Kirby Smarts, like those guys aren't out there to help him and be part of what he's doing. The offensive line is a mess and has been a mess for 2 years now. The quarterback, Bryce Young bailed him out, but there is no Bryce Young on this roster. And, oh, by the way, even if, they have the number one quarterback signed for next year, it's not as though he's going to be ready to play next year. It's going to be a 2-year proposition with him. So the quarterback situation, unless you can find a guy in the portal that's ready to play next year, it's probably not getting solved overnight. That's my question for you, Jason. Do you think he has enough in the tank to turn this thing around? Because I don't see it turning around either this year, even though the SEC is down. I still think there's too many good teams, too many tough road environments. Do you think he has it in him to turn this around? Because the answers don't appear to be on this roster, and it's not pretty right now.
I think it's doubtful on the energy thing, and this is what I have said now for a couple of years. Before last season, and I set up that question to Fowler, and I said, before last season, I said 3 years, I think he'll be out. And it's not about, and he said, he's not a quitter. I agree with that. I don't think he's a quitter. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is the way he finished that same answer. When you do take into consideration he's 72, you consider what's happening to college football as a whole. You look at what's about to happen with the SEC bringing in Oklahoma and Texas. You look at the Big Ten and the redesign. You look at NIL. You look at the transfer portal. You look at the complete lack of an authoritative body at present right now with the NCAA. You look at all of that, and then you see yourself at 72, and right now you're watching a team that's not up to par, that's not up to snuff with what you're used to, and that's probably nagging at you anyway. I just think the energy can just get snuffed right out of you. It's not about quitting. It's about Danny Glover. I'm getting too old for this. It's Lethal Weapon. That's what it is. It's how much longer do you really have fun doing this? If you're not having fun anymore, go home, be with your wife. Go take that big TV job they put you on. Anytime you're not in the college football playoff, you're on a booth somewhere. If you want to do that, then that option's going to be available to you. I think eventually the grind is a lot easier to tolerate when you're winning. Everything is better when you're winning. If you're struggling and you're still trying to wrap your brain around everything that's happening in the landscape of college football, I just think that can end up leaving you dry. It can leave you kind of an energy desert, especially at 72, and that's why I believe he walks away. Not because he can't win, not because he's quitting, just because I think he's probably had about enough, and there's nothing really left for him to prove.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because I tend to think it's probably going to end poorly. And poorly's relative. He's the greatest that we've ever seen. It's not, going to be whatever. But I think if we're talking realistically, is Nick Saban at 72 years old in October he'll turn 72. Is he ever going to win another national championship? I think the answer is probably no, because again, I don't think you have that quarterback on the roster this year. Now, even if the SEC's bad, you're still going to run into a Quinn Ewers, a Caleb Williams, whoever, a Bo Nix, somebody like that in the postseason. Even if the SEC's terrible and you somehow survive it, you're gonna run into good quarterback play at some point. I don't think you have the dudes. The one thing I will say, and I think this was an interesting point by Fowler as well, is that maybe the new rules help Bama, right? Because you can, if you don't have the quarterback, go get that guy in one offseason. You can fill roster holes, deficiencies in one offseason, whether it's on the offensive line, whether it's somewhere on the defense, whatever. The other thing, too, with the 12-team playoff coming, and I was thinking about this. I was listening to one of Nick Saban's press conferences this week, or it wasn't the press conference. It was when he was on with Pat McAfee. And he was talking about, it's a process, staying the course, blah, 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 this and that. And I will say, as weird as it sounds with the 12-team college football playoff, like it sounds like it just became that much harder because you have to win at least one more and maybe even two more games in a season. But one or two, like Alabama, if they can just get competent quarterback play, they should be in that playoff every single year. And then it's can you get hot once you're there? So maybe those things sustain him. But I do tend to agree with you, Jason, is I think the clock is really ticking, and I think the energy thing is a real thing when you have a bunch of a bunch of coaches that you're not familiar with. Kirby Smart was around forever. He's not around. Steve Sarkisian had with you for a while. He's not around. I just think it's really tough, and you brought up the great point. It's one thing to reload a roster every single year, but when you're losing a star coordinator and then he's bringing 4 or 5 coaches with him to the next spot, it's just a lot to ask to reshake up your staff, 4, 5, 6 guys every single year, keep that continuity, and I think that's ultimately what could do him in.
Yeah, and again, you're turning that staff over not one time. You're turning over, especially on the offensive side, you're turning over an offensive coordinator pretty regularly if you're Nick Saban at Alabama. And eventually, you're just not going to have the A guy. You're going to have the C-plus guy, or you're going to have the B-minus guy. You're always going to have your pick of somebody that's competent, but you've gotten used to a certain lifestyle. And another thing Fowler said was that the coordinators got lazy over the last few years because of how special Bryce Young was. And we talked about this last year. Bryce Young I don't think Bryce Young got enough credit for what he did last year because I didn't think that team was very good. But Bryce Young would put them in a scenario where they could always win on his back. And the same thing was true with Caleb Williams, who ends up winning the Heisman, and deservedly so. But I thought those two guys were mammoth in that regard. And really and truly, we do need to start looking at how difficult it can be to reload. And we talked about the coaches, but certainly at the quarterback spot. But if you're Alabama, you should never be in a situation where you don't have an answer at all at quarterback. Not in 2023. Not with the football factory that you have created, instituted, and in effect you have used it to dominate the sport more than anyone else in Nick Saban's tenure over this last 15-year span or however long it's been exactly. That should not be a thing that is happening. That's what's so baffling about it to me. Even though you have a lot of other problems, the fact that you don't have a quarterback that can help you in this scenario is mind-blowing.